What's up guys, I'm Calderon and welcome back to the last section of the How to Make a Beat series. Today we are talking about mixing and mastering. So before we dive in, I really do want to point out that although there is very much a technical, scientific approach to mixing, it is still very much an art. Meaning that the way you hear music is not going to be the same way that I hear music, which means that the way that you mix your beats is not going to be the same way that I mix mine. Like many videos or all the videos in this series, the goal for you is to, or the goal really is for you to see what I'm doing in my process and maybe implement some of those tactics into your own. But again, this is all very subjective. Now I will be going over some of the things, more like technical stuff that I tend to do to make sure everything translates well. But at the end of the day, it is whatever you hear to be right, because it's, you know, it's your beat. And then second, I do realize that my process is a little unorthodox because a lot of people now, they tend to mix as they produce. But in my mind, for some reason, production and mixing are like two separate phases. Maybe it's more of a traditional approach, I don't know. But I do tend to produce first, and then I transfer those files over and make my, and then mix the beat. So that is what I'm gonna be doing or going over today. Now, because there's so much information, I didn't wanna make like a 30-minute long video. So instead, I'm gonna chop this up into two. In this video, we're gonna be going over how I prepare my files for mixing. I'm gonna show you guys my mixing template, and I'll show you how I route my sounds and how I gain stage. And in a video following this one, we'll go over how to create a static mix, which some people call leveling, plugin use, and mastering. But with that being said, this video will be relatively longer than the rest because there's a lot to cover. So sit tight, strap up, and let's get to it. All right, so I've actually already mixed this beat. I'm gonna show you guys what I have so far, but then I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of replicate the whole thing so we can both go through the process together. Now, as you can see here, this is the mixing template. This is my mixing session, everything that I've added. The only thing that I will note though is that in the last week's video, I completely forgot to add a second hook after the second verse. And I fixed that in the mixing session, which this ultimately is a bigger testament to how much I love the arrangement tool from Studio One, because as opposed to having to like go back and, change that and then re-import, all I did literally was I dragged these labels over, and then I just copied a hook over to this section and brought everything back. So that tool just makes everything easy. But anyway, I'm gonna let you guys listen to the mix real quick, and then we'll kind of go over the whole process like I said. So here we go. So that is my mix for this beat. Now, if anything sounds a little low, that's because I haven't activated the mastering plugins, because for some reason, the recording software, for the screen recording software that I use, if I did, it would have like distorted everything, and it would have, so to save your guys' ears, I'm just gonna leave it as it is. But this beat will be available at the end so you guys can listen to the whole thing in its entirety. Okay, so this is a production session from last week, and as you guys can see, this is where I missed the hook part. So I'm just gonna bring this over. I'm gonna take this hook, place it there, and then bring everything back. Okay, so as you can see, I kind of do like a rough mix as I'm producing. This is just so I can hear what the beat is gonna sound like at the end. Now, like I said, I take this and I transfer the files over to a mixing template, and I start over per se, but as far as production goes, I do kind of mess around with levels and panning and maybe add like an EQ here and there just to kind of see how the beat would sound like. But when I'm mixing, I take all of that off. So the first step in that process for me is to set all the faders to 0. So what you can do, a quick shortcut, is if you hit the command key on your Mac keyboard and you click on one of the faders, it'll set it back to 0. So I will do that for all of the tracks in my current session, making sure they're all at 0. So let's go ahead and do that now. And the cool thing too is that you can do this with like panning pots. So if you take a look up top here, the guitars, when I had panned them, you can just go and set them back to center. The next thing I do is I turn off all the plugins. So Studio One has a nifty little on and off switch, global on and off plugin switch. So if I hit that, it takes everything off. So boom, there it is. Now the last step for me in preparing the mix is to make sure that I convert all the MIDI files into WAV files. Now if you take a look, we kind of played a bit of a Tetris puzzle game here. Everything has its own block. Now if I were to export this, we would literally, every block would be a WAV file. So that would be an absolute nightmare for the mixing engineer, because whenever they import that into their session, they would have like a zillion tracks of small bits, and you don't want that. So to fix that, what you do is I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna hit Command A to highlight everything. Then I'm gonna hit the G key on my keyboard, and it kind of consolidates everything into one file. Now, as you can see, there's like gaps here in the beginning, so I'm just gonna grab one because they're already all selected and just drag it to the beginning. And then towards the end, I'm gonna pick a spot after the end that I can make sure all the files are lining up to. So 74, let's say. So let's drag that there. Now the reason I drag all files even like 2 bars after everything is ended is because MIDI files and WAV files don't act the same. A MIDI file, let's say if it's like a VST piano, if it has like built-in reverb, the reverb will play out until the software kind of fades it out. But if you convert that into a wave, wherever the end of that MIDI file is, that is where the wave will stop. So if there's a reverb that was kind of baked in, it'll stop there abruptly. It won't end quietly or end, you know, in a fade. So essentially by dragging everything a couple bars after the beat has ended, you have that freedom to later fade things how you want. So once we have everything kind of lined up and uniform, and you know all your faders are set to 0, all your plugins are turned off, what I do is I hit Command A to select everything and then hit Command B. Now what this function does, it converts all your files into WAV files. And on top of that, it also puts them into their own little folder called bounces, which you can later reach. So let's go ahead and do that now. So Command A, Command B. So the whole thing probably takes about a minute or two, but essentially, like I said, it deposits everything into like this bounces folder, and you have all the files here. Now, some of the benefits that I see to this process is that, let's say, for example, you're uploading your beats to like a BeatStars or an Airbit, and you license them online. Well, a lot of times they have an option for you to license your WAV trackout files. Well, essentially with this process, it created this folder for you that has all the WAV trackouts, and all you have to do is kind of right-click, compress, which is the same thing as zipping, and then you would just upload that zip file to whatever platform you use, and that would be it. On top of that, a lot of times when you get this over to like a rapper or their engineer, they might not want all the effects that you would have added in the production phase. They might not want that reverb that you had on that snare, or you know, whatever else. So that's why I take out all my plugins, I keep them dry, and I keep them ready for whenever they're needed. Now, of course, add your mix like I'm gonna show you, but it's always a good idea to keep a folder of the dry original stems. Now the next thing I do here is I open up my mixing template and I import all the files from that bounces folder that we just created. So here we have my mixing template, and as you guys can see here, it has a bit of a routing scheme kind of setup. Now I did not create this mixing template, I wish I did, but it was actually created by a fellow YouTuber in Floridian, Craftmaster Productions. He did a video one time where he kind of discussed one of his templates, and I think he uses this more for like production, but I found the value for me in mixing, so definitely shout out to him. I'm gonna link him down below. It's just a really great guy in our community. Anyway, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and open up the bounces folder. I'm gonna hit Command A, and I'm gonna just drag everything into my template. Pull this back, zoom out real quick, and we're just gonna drag everything till the end. But as you guys can see here, everything is uniform, and they all end in the same place, which is exactly what we want. I'm gonna go in here and add the BPM, which was 96. Make sure everything lines up. So as you guys can see, I do have some folders going on here. I do pack all my sounds. This just helps me to be more organized when I'm mixing. But I'm gonna take the bass and the close hat. For some reason, the bass to me is like part of the drums. I don't know, but I'm gonna take the bass, the close hat, the crash, the easy drummer, which is a toms, we'll rename it in a bit, the kick, open hat, and the snare. And we'll drag those into the drums folder. And let's go ahead and rename this to toms. We're gonna close this, and then we're gonna take the guitar, the lead, the Rhodes, and the sample. And we're gonna drag it over to our instruments folder. And then even here, I like to kind of rearrange things. So sample goes at the top, then we got Rhodes, then we have the lead, then we have guitar left and right. For my drums, I like to keep the bass up top. Then we do kick, then snare, and then let's do close hat, open hat, toms, and crash. There it is. Now, if we take a look at the mixing console real quick, I do want to kind of go over what this routing schematic does and why it helps me. So if we take a look closely, we do have a bit of a VCA fader pair going on. I'll explain what they do in a minute. We also have some buses. So we have an instrument bus. Essentially, everything that's melodic gets dumped into this bus. We have a drums bus, so same thing, all the drums go into here. We have a filter bus. So essentially, if you want to add an effect to the entire beat, you can add it to this track. A popular use for this is if you want to add like a OVO, low pass underwater kind of effect, you can add that here. The filter bypass is literally just to exclude any sounds that you don't want to be affected by that, filter. And then lastly, we have a submix bus, a mix bus, and a master bus. Now I realize this is kind of like a discussion all on its own, but I do not add any plugins to my master bus, and I do not change that from 0. That fader stays at 0 at all times. So then essentially what I use these two for is I use my mix bus to add my mastering chain, because again, I don't add any plugins to my master bus. And the submix bus, I essentially just use it to see where my mix is peaking before it hits the mastering chain. And I'll explain the importance of all this in a little bit, but anyway, so back to kind of routing everything. I take the instrument VCA fader bus, I drag it to the front or in front of the last instrument, and then I'll take the drum, and it's already there, so at the end of the drums. And essentially what this does, it allows me to manipulate the volume of a bunch of different faders. So as opposed to, let's say for example, I'm gonna just drag them over and route them real quick. Let's say for example, I wanted to change the volume of all the instruments instead of having to do, this, dragging everything down. I can just literally go over here and drag everything all at once. So that's super useful. So I'm gonna do the same thing for the drums. And as you guys can see, I can manipulate the volume of that. Now the next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna route all my instruments to the instrument bus. Same thing for the drums, they all go to the drums bus. Now the difference between a VCA fader and a bus is that a VCA fader, all it does is control the volume. In the bus, you can actually insert plugins to control or affect a group of elements together. That's really it. So once everything is routed, the next step is for me to gain stage. Now, if you're unfamiliar with gain staging, think of it like this. A lot of times, whenever you import your samples to make a beat, they won't all peak at the same level. So let's say you buy your favorite drum kit from wherever and you import the kick. That kick might already be limited and compressed and EQ'd and all that stuff, so it might be peaking at 0. And then if you go in there and you record like a piano like I did, like a Rhodes, after it's recorded, you might realize that that is peaking at -6. So whenever you import those sounds into a mixing session, or most importantly, whenever somebody else imports them into a mixing session, even though the faders will be by default at 0, those two elements will not be at the same volume because one came in at 0, one came in at -6. So essentially one of the things that gain staging does, it allows you the opportunity to balance those two so you're better equipped to approach a mix. On top of that, by gain staging, you also provide or create the headroom that will be necessary whenever the artist hops on to record that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So to do this in Studio One, there's two options. You could do it through the mixing console by using the Mix Tool plugin, which essentially all it does, it lowers or raises the gain of a track. But I don't really like to use this because this is a plugin. This will use CPU or computer power, which you kind of want to reserve for actual mixing plugins. So another way to do it for me, which is more feasible, is if you look at your track, there's this little button in the center. If you lower this or raise this, it does the exact same thing as a plugin, so it just kind of messes with the gain. So essentially the way I do that here is I solo each track one by one, I play them and I listen and I mess with this until that track is peaking at -6. But alright guys, that's it for this one. Like I said, if you're watching this now, there is already a part 2 to this on my channel, so definitely go check that out. But again, thank you for watching. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you're not already, and make sure to head over to that second video so we can finish this series together.